When I think about the Facebook adventure with Libra, I still call it Libra because it's a better name than DM. When I basically decided it was not worth fighting for it anymore, I felt really good, like really, really good, that we had tried everything in our power and then some to convince regulators and world powers basically that this was something of merit and that the world needed, but it just wasn't going to happen.
What was the core reason it wasn't going to happen?
It was just really hard for regulators and others to accept that Facebook would be at the center of a protocol for money for the internet. And that's why we devolved so much power into this consortium that we didn't control, that we're just a member of. But that wasn't enough.
David, I am so excited for this. I heard so many great things from Dana at Matrix, from Shaq, of course, Frederick at Felix, but thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to finally connect.
Now, I love to go back to the very beginning. You founded your first company, I didn't know whether to say this, in the year I was born, in 1996. How did you come to found your first company, David?
Well, I think it was a series of events in my personal life, as well as a deeply rooted frustration about a monopoly, one of telecom and internet service providers in Switzerland, where I was at the time. But basically, I was forced to drop out of college because of a family situation where, the family lost everything. And then I had to go try to figure out how to make money, which took me to working in a bank, which I really didn't like. But that's what you do when you're in Switzerland. And then after a year at that bank, I decided I was frustrated enough with the state of the telecoms industry in Switzerland that was a monopoly basically at the time, and decided that knowing almost nothing, or actually nothing, about the telecoms business, I was going to try to go and build a company to compete with the incumbent at the time, and that's how I started.
David, there are so many things for me to unpack there. You said about losing everything. I hope it's okay for me to ask. My family did too, and it gave me a ferociousness that I would never, ever let that happen again. How did it impact you seeing your family lose everything?
Yeah, I think, the same deal here. I think that, I'm actually thankful that this happened in my life, because I think it put me on a very different trajectory that I would have been otherwise. So it definitely pushed me to rebuild from scratch at a perfect age, actually. So I'm actually thankful that this happened to me.
You mentioned also the entrance with the telecoms industry. I'm a big believer in Warren Buffett's kind of suggestion of kind of the importance of markets and how even great entrepreneurs in bad markets, it's not a good outcome. Do you agree with centrality of market, where there are just some shit markets to operate in? And I respectfully say that with regards to telecom.
Well, at the time, bear in mind that this was before broadband and all of that, right? So you already made me sound older, but I'm going to do that to myself now. But at the time, it was dial-up internet and switched telecommunications, and a call between Europe and the U.S. was about $1 a minute, and so that industry really deserved to be disrupted. And it was a fun first thing to do.
Can I ask, you also mentioned not knowing a huge amount about telecoms before diving in. Do you believe that naivety is good for entrepreneurs?
Oh, of course, it's essential, because if you know too much for your own good, then you know all the things that are not possible, and that basically prevents you from doing the things that everyone else think are impossible, and that's one of the hallmark of entrepreneurship.
I spoke to Frederick Court before the show, and he said, ask David about how that experience founding GTN and the rides post that being acquired impacted how you think and operate today, and if there are applicable lessons to the downturn today.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a really crazy roller coaster at the end of GTN, because we basically got like a very respectable investment bank pitching us to go public at multiples of billions of euros of market cap at the time. And then a year later, more or less, we sold the company to a company that was listed on the Nasdaq, was worth about $3-4 billion, which at the time was a lot. And then we did that deal. We took stock payment for the acquisition, and I had a 12 months lockup to get my stock basically unlocked so I could sell it and be liquid. And the company went belly up on months 11 of that 12 months lockup. So the first lesson that I got there was actually, next time I'm selling a company, I'm definitely taking cash. So that was good for the following one. But I think, there's a real lesson in timing here, and really, really being cognizant and eyes wide open about the timing and the luck that is involved with being at the right place at the right time and not missing the turn. That's a lesson that I think became really, really helpful as I started building Echovox, that then became Zong.
Can I ask, when you say missing the turn, what do you mean by that, David?
Well, it's just that, I feel like we were in a pretty good position to actually exit probably a year before, but we decided to continue riding that market that was, red hot at the time. And this was the time where everyone was rolling fiber optic everywhere in Europe, and telecoms were red hot, and everyone was really excited about incumbents being disrupted and newcomers in the space, which was a telecom boom. And we just missed the turn by a little bit. But had we sold basically 6 months, 9 months before, I wouldn't have been in the situation I ended up being in.
You then founded Zong in 2008, and you moved to the Valley. Why did you decide to move to the Valley, and can great companies not be built from Europe, David?
Well, first of all, the Zong thing is actually a much longer arc. So I sold the company, and then a couple of months later, I started a new company, which was called Echovox, which was basically the same company as Zong ended up being. We just pivoted at I think the right time this time around. And basically, Echovox was doing premium SMS products, so voting for Pop Idol and all of the TV shows, downloading ringtones and wallpapers and games on mobile phones. And it did quite well. The year that I had this big push with my board to move to Silicon Valley, I think we were on track to doing about $30 million of revenue. We had 3x our revenue, and it was 2007, and basically the iPhone came to the market, and I came to the realization that if you have an iPhone that has access to the internet, all of the things that we were offering were going to be disrupted greatly. I mean, no one was going to actually pay $2 to download a ringtone or a wallpaper for a feature phone when you have access to the internet on a smartphone. And that's what made me want to push really hard on my board that wasn't very favorable or favorable at all at the time to move to Silicon Valley and try to convert all of the connections that we had with all of these mobile operators into a payments product, which Zong ended up being the result of. So that's the long arc of the next episode here.
Can great companies be built in Europe, David?
Yeah, of course. But it's a lot harder. And we've seen, of course, amazingly successful companies in Europe. But the reason I think it's harder is because, if you start, let's say, in France, then you have an addressable market that is, basically the worst size, right? Because it's actually too big for you to branch out early, but too small for you to build a world or global defining company. And so you're kind of stuck in this world, and every time you need to branch out and go to another market, it's a different culture, a different language, Definitely at the time, a different set of rules, and now again a different set of rules. And so, it's hard enough to build a very successful tech company, and you just have more constraints, and then also advantages. If you're building in Europe, you have arguably less competition for talent, and so there are advantages, but it's definitely harder.
Can I ask, I always think we learn from our mistakes. What are the biggest fuck-ups you made with Zong, and how did they impact your mindset?
Well, I think one of the things that we did is we tried at some point to branch out of carrier billing, of mobile operator-based payments, and basically enable people to basically link a credit card or debit card to their mobile number so they could do mobile payments, and mobile operators would actually take a smaller cut. And that was a bold move, but it backfired at the time, and we almost lost the company if it wasn't for a very fortunate breakfast with at the time the head of that platform at AT&T, because we were competing head on with a company that was called Boku, that had raised way more money than we did, that was way more connected than we were. And this push that we made at that time was actually a little tone deaf, because of course they leveraged that to try to get us canceled from the programs that we were part of and that were essential to the company actually serving their customers. And Facebook was actually one of our biggest customers at the time. And so we almost lost it all because I didn't read the room the right way at the time. And thankfully, I was able to save the company by trying to basically engage with AT&T at the time and figure out a path out of that situation that was being taken advantage of. So, but that was a lesson. It's like, you need to read the room and don't, get over your skis, especially when you're dependent on third parties.
I love that in terms of reading the room. I think it's so important both internally and externally. I'm hopping, and so I'm sorry for kind of hopping through careers. But Zong was then acquired by PayPal in 2011, and you joined as a VP. It was, such a transformative institution. When you think about like 1 to 2 of the biggest takeaways for you from that experience that really impacted your mindset today, are there some that stand out?
So I think, the first thing is I was actually really passionate about PayPal. So when the acquisition closed, instead of staying in our office in Menlo Park at the time, I asked to have a desk at PayPal, and I moved immediately, first day. And I wanted to try to figure out how to operate in this new environment at the company, which is an unusual thing to do. Like typically, if you're acquired, you're trying to preserve the unit that you've built, like the company, and not integrate yourself, because it's a lot of overhead and complicated. But again, like I didn't know what I was doing. I had never worked in a large organization like that before. And so I went there, and it became really obvious at the time that the company really needed to innovate on mobile aggressively. And it didn't have a card-present terminal at the time, where Square was actually really, really capturing market share in the offline market. And so I decided that I needed to try to do something about it. And in the span of 6 months or less, we basically had our product in the market, which was the first hardware product that PayPal had shipped. And, that changed the trajectory, I think, of what followed, because, a few months after I joined, Scott Thompson left to become the CEO. Scott Thompson, who was leading PayPal at the time, left to become the CEO of Yahoo. And of all of the people who were on that leadership team at the time, I was probably the one really not wanting that job. I was like, okay, now I'm going to go back to startup land. But John Donahoe, who was leading eBay at the time, this was at the time where PayPal was still part of eBay, asked me to actually take over the leadership role at PayPal, which was an insane steep learning curve for me. going from managing 200 people at most to 16, 17,000 people literally overnight.
What was the hardest thing in that transition?
The hardest thing was actually that I came into this really cold and not really knowing how a corporate organization functioned, which was kind of probably a blessing for me. But the hardest thing was actually the frustration of seeing so many people who were there, not because they believed in the mission or because they were passionate about a specific product or solving a specific problem, but just coasting there and being at the company and taking their paycheck home and punching in, and that was really hard for me. And so the culture of the company as well at that time, like it had lost a lot of its innovation mojo, and a lot of their best engineers were gone. There were a bunch left, but a lot of them had basically gone to other companies over the years. And so I started.
Can you change a culture at that scale? It's so big then. Can you change culture then?
Well, I think we did. It was very brutal. I mean, I kind of went with instinct at the time, and I started changing everything basically in a fairly brutal way. And the reason I decided, I proactively decided to do it in a brutal way is I wanted it to be a shock to the culture so that it became uncomfortable to the people who wouldn't be a cultural fit for the company. That's when we basically acquired Braintree and Venmo and tried to bring that talent and that energy into the company.
I think the challenge is when you're often very far ahead or when you have that scale. You tweeted recently, and I love this as a tweet. It was fantastic. America will remain in the lead if it stops getting its own way. You can feel nations pulling away from the US dollar. I was actually just messaging with Hugo Bauer, our mutual friend, before this, and he thought this was a good question. How could America stop getting its own way? And what would that look like, David?
Well, I think, it's important to get back to why people like me and before me and after me came to this country to build innovative companies. The first one is the rule of law and a level playing field. That's kind of the basics. But the most important one is actually the fact that if you're innovating and you're solving a real problem, then, basically you have an option of doing that, and no one's going to stand in your way. So this meritocracy of you're coming to this country, you're innovating, you're building something great, and you're creating jobs in the process, and you're in the lead. I think that that requires a certain set of conditions to be met, and I feel like right now you need to come up with clear regulations when it touches, like especially the industry that I'm in, clear regulations that protect consumers, but also that enables innovators to go build the things that are going to continue keeping the country ahead. And then I think there are all kinds of other foreign policy considerations here that are at play. But when you look at the tea leaves right now, it's really not looking great. It feels a little bit like we're on the path of an end of an empire of sorts, and that's probably reversible if there's concerted effort to actually really focus on what America's done really, really the best at, in the world at, and is actually getting innovators to come here and innovate and build things.
What are the most significant signs of the tea leaves not looking great?
Well, I mean, you look at a number of companies that are now not being built in the U.S. I mean, one good example is actually the first customer that we announced at Lightspark, which is a bank, a European bank now, which is called Xapo. That company was actually in the U.S. and they left the U.S. because they didn't feel like they had the regulatory clarity that they needed to continue investing here. That's just one example. But there are many more in this space that have left or decide to avoid the market because there's just no clarity of rules of engagements, so to speak. I think, on the geopolitical side, you can see all kinds of countries that used to be allies of the U.S. trying to pull away from the dollar and the magnetic force field, so to speak, of the dollar. And I think that's the result of overuse of sanctions and misalignment internationally between the U.S. and its former allies. And I think that's also a typical telltale of what's to come when you're actually you have the reserve currency of the world and people are trying to pull away from it.
David, I think we're all going nuts. I think we're all focused on the minutiae, and it's like, hang on a minute. The Saudi-Iran deal that was struck in the last few weeks means that the US dollar's kind of been unpegged as the reserve currency for oil that it's had for so many years, destabilizing the power and prominence of the US dollar, and no one really is talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think you bring up a good point, which is it's not only losing the competitive edge that the U.S. has with bringing the best innovators and the best minds to the country and keeping them here. It's also really pulling away from the dollar, but it's also China and a bunch of other countries trying to reset the order, the world order, the way it actually has been in our lifetimes, for sure.
How do you see them trying to reset the world order?
I think that the reality is the U.S. was the main broker of the world order and the giant at the table. And they've left a certain vacuum, I think. We've left as a country a certain vacuum that is now trying to be filled by other nation states that are vying for this position of being in the lead.
Speaking of kind of being in the lead, I want to go to another of your fantastic tweets. Clearly, I'm a fanboy of your Twitter stream. But you said so much of entrepreneurship is believing in what is unbelievable to others and then doing whatever it takes to manifest it into reality. Let's put that on you and Lightspark. What do you believe with Lightspark that's unbelievable to others?
Well, I think that what we believe here is that the world desperately needs a protocol for payments or for money on the internet. And when you think about the early days of the internet, you actually had this HTTP 402 protocol that was supposed to be a request for payment and was supposed to be built, but never was. And that's our core belief. Our core belief is you need an open, interoperable, dirt cheap protocol for payments or money on the internet that settles in real time and enables people to move value around the world on the internet the same way that they send an email or a text message. So that's what we believe in, and that's what we're trying to facilitate here at Lightspark.
Can I ask, when we think about kind of believing in terms of you believe it, but unbelievable to others, there is a point in entrepreneurship when something's just not working. How do you think about the balance, and for entrepreneurs advising them, the balance between sticking to your vision and believing what others don't versus actually it's not working and they don't believe for a reason?
Well, I think that there's a long way to answer that question, so I'm going to stick with the short version. The first one is you need to feel good about having tried everything when you pull the plug, and I think that's important. But you also need to be able to read the room, read the metrics, understand if you've launched a product that doesn't find product market fit and you've iterated on it like for a long while, that you need to change what you do or stop. I think, in our case, when I think about the Facebook adventure with Libra, I still call it Libra because it's a better name than DM. But when I basically decided it was not worth fighting for it anymore, I felt really good, like really, really good, that we had tried everything in our power and then some to convince regulators and world powers basically that this was something of merit and that the world needed, but it just wasn't going to happen.
What was the core reason it wasn't going to happen?
I think it was just really hard for regulators and others to accept that Facebook would be at the center of a protocol for money for the internet. Um, and actually that any private company would be at the center of that. And that's why we devolved so much power into this consortium that we didn't control, that we're just a member of. But that wasn't enough. And I think that the political, it was very political, to be clear. And I think the political pressure on regulators to not enable a company with the reach of Facebook to actually be at the helm of such a project was just unsurmountable.
Can I ask, in terms of choke points there, that was a choke point for Libra. What do you think are the single biggest choke points for crypto today, on one side for crypto and then on the other side for the regulators?
Well, I don't know about the regulators piece, but I would say that, as far as crypto is concerned, the industry has lost a number of banks that were really providing services to crypto companies that were essential. So the on-ramps between the fiat or legacy rails to crypto is absolutely essential, and a lot of these banks are now gone. And so that's a problem. That's a very significant problem for the entire industry.
What happens as a result? What's the fallout from the debanking of crypto?
So I think that the interesting thing is this can go two ways. One is there can be new institutions that appear, and there are a number of new banks that are coming up. One is called Lead Bank, that is led by Jackie Reeses, actually, someone that if you didn't have on your podcast, you should have on your podcast at some point.
Do you know who asked this question, David?
No.
Jackie Reeses.
Oh, well, there you go. There you go. So leading question and leading and resulting desired answer, which is like you have new institutions that are seizing the opportunity of serving the crypto industry, and I think that'll happen. I think the alternative is actually that you push the entire industry to be on the fringe and on the margin, and all of these transactions become peer-to-peer and more opaque to regulation, which is absolutely the worst outcome for everyone involved, including consumers and others, because it basically gets out of the purview of the regulators. So I think it's important that this industry works hand in hand with the rest of the industry and with regulators to actually reach the right outcome. And it's important that we let innovators innovate.
I mean, that was kind of my point there. When you look at Coinbase receiving notice from the SEC, and all they've done brilliantly to be partners to the SEC and collaborate, why would you bother if you're an entrepreneur? Why not go to the outskirts, do an FTX bluntly? Is there a benefit to holding hands with regulators anymore?
Well, I don't know about holding hands, but engaging in earnest and trying to reach the right outcome, the right balance between protecting consumers and stimulating innovation, I think is absolutely essential. And I think, Brian Armstrong has done a really, really good job at balancing this. And from the get-go decided that he wanted to play by the rules, and has been desperately demanding clear rules from the various regulators. And, certainly, I think over the long run, if you're playing the long game, that's the only way. And I think they're going to be a very successful company because they think about it over the long run, and they're not taking shortcuts. So I think that's the right way to build a long-standing company.
David, if you were in charge of the SEC today, you're setting the regulation, what would you do?
Well, I think that the clarity is the most important thing. You need to give clear rules so that companies that are playing in the industry know exactly what is okay and what is not okay. And right now, basically, it's regulation by enforcement, and it doesn't help because there's just not a clear rule set of what is okay and what is not. So I think that's the first and biggest priority here.
Do you think they're close to providing clarity? Do you think we will see that?
I certainly hope so, but if we're staying on our current path, I don't think it will happen soon. But I hope that the entire industry gets a lot of clarity. I think there are interesting things happening on the legislative side. So notably, the House Financial Services Committee is working on a number of proposed bills that I think would clarify a little bit of the murky waters that we're in right now. So I think there's hope, but those things take a long time, and it's really complicated to get consensus across the aisle.
Can I ask what worries you most for the next 1 to 3 years when you project forward in terms of kind of the crypto industry that you operate in?
Well, I don't think about it that way. I think that let me turn the question a little bit. I think what I'm enthusiastic about in our space is actually the fact that we have basically gone out of that speculative phase where it was really easy for anyone to create a token out of thin air and go for these get rich quick schemes, right? I think we're done with that, or almost done with that, and I think that's why you see a lot more innovation coming back to Bitcoin as well, because people have come to realize that actually building real products that solve real people's problems is the way to leverage the technology and build something of value versus taking a shortcut and listing a token and dumping it on the public retail market. So I'm actually really enthusiastic that we're in this new phase. And I think a lot of really good innovation and products will come out in the next few years.
Speaking of kind of great products that come out in the next few years, who do you think will be the winners and who do you think will be the losers in the next wave of crypto?
Well, I mean, back to my earlier point, I think the winners will be people and teams that are able to build products and services that solve real problems versus just financial engineering and trying to make a quick buck. And so I think the former category will be the defining and winning category of the industry in the next few years.
I think when I project out, there's one other thing I have to talk to you about, which is kind of the future of AI. And you tweeted a lot about this, again, stalking your Twitter feed. What are you most excited for with it? Let's start with the positives.
Well, I think that this is the beginning of a new compute era. It's a new computing platform, and I don't think a lot of people are talking about it that way, but it is exactly that. It's a new computing platform that will enable a new wave of innovation to be unleashed and a new wave of companies to be built around it. And it's really, really very exciting. I think the ability for you to basically have these superpowers at your fingertip is really remarkable. And it's a non-linear step change here.
Can I ask, how are you integrating into your teams and your products with Lightspark?
There are a number of things that we're thinking about, notably around plugins and around, how do we make our documentation and integrations a lot simpler. But of course, we are providing accounts to everyone who works at the company so they can actually use it and get those superpowers. And so it's kind of interesting. I feel like right now it's really great at breaking down steps for coding for people who don't know how to code really well. But it's not yet great at coding. It's good at coding, but not great. I think the next few versions will be really great at coding, which is also where potential problems might come from. But I think the ability of those large language models to actually build themselves into other products and leverage other APIs is going to be a fascinating thing and a potentially scary thing as well. But I'm more on the fascinating side for now.
Can I ask one thing that I think everyone's kind of agreeing on is bluntly the ability for 10 people to create billion-dollar companies again with the leverage that AI and kind of co-creation that will be enabled by AI. How do you think about income equality and how that will be impacted by the future next 3 years of AI?
I mean, look, I think it cuts both ways. I feel like on the inequality, it's also going to be a great equalizer because think about all of the people out there that can't even defend themselves or have the ability to write the right letter to be sent to the right governmental body or company to look after their own interests right now and typically get steamrolled over and over again by the system. Now they have, an ally that can, actually write these letters and fight for them and do all of these things. That's just one example, right? But there are millions of others. I think that actually a lot of people who didn't have access to fancy attorneys and the likes will find a lot of value here. And I also think that, by the way, if you have an idea of a product that you want to build, to your point, having those superpowers at your fingertip is going to enable many more people to start companies and build new things that wouldn't have been possible for them to build before. So I'm a kind of glass half full person when I think about this. I think that it's more of a democratization of tools that were available to a few that is now available to almost everyone. And you can see that actually. I think the last number I saw was that, ChatGPT had over 100 million users and got to this number without network effects, like direct network effects, which is stunning. And that shows that it's a mass market product.
Can I ask, David, how do you think about your relationship to money? I know it's a bit of a weird one, but you mentioned losing it earlier. I think it's a very important question to ask. And we spoke about income equality there and your positive attitude on life. I'm just intrigued how you think about your own relationship to money now.
Well, I mean, when you ask that question, the first thing I think about is, I'm dedicating the rest of my life to making money work better and move the way it should move, like bits and bytes on the internet. So that's from that standpoint, it's definitely a fusional relationship with trying to make money work better. So I think, from that standpoint, it's a very relevant question. On the more personal side, I'm a capitalist, and I think that if people solve big problems for a large number of individuals or companies, and they do so through a great deal of sacrifices and efforts, that they should be rewarded for that. And I think it's great that people come from nothing and build very successful lives by trying to be focused on solving these problems. I think it's inspiring, and it's a virtuous cycle that I hope continues way after we're all gone.
I was trying to find an easy way to fit that in, but I thought, fuck it, just go direct. I want to move into a quick fire, David. So I say a short statement. You give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
So will we be in a better or a worse macro position at the end of this year?
Worse.
Why?
Because I think that it's going to be, we're in this situation where you have to land a plane that is full of jet fuel, and it's coming in heavy when it comes to balancing the runway inflation risks and not blowing up our entire long tail of banks that are absolutely essential to the economy. And I think it's going to be a really tough balancing act for the Fed. And I think that the chances are greater that we will end up being in a recession. Is it going to be a long-standing one or a short one? I don't know, but I think we're not out of it by any stretch of imagination, and I hope I'm wrong.
Do rates go even higher?
I think the rates will go a bit higher before they'll stop raising them.
How do we stop more bank runs?
Well, I think, they did the backstop provisions that should calm the markets, but hopefully it holds. I think, the psychological effects of people learning in an accelerated fashion about fractional reserve banking is I think, a long-term benefit, but a short-term risk to the system.
Why make the move to LA to build Lightspark rather than Silicon Valley?
Well, I think, after 16 years in the Bay Area, it was time to be here, and it's great. Honestly, I didn't know whether it would actually work out, but We've been able to convince amazing talent to move here. A lot of talent actually left the Bay Area during the COVID years and felt even more compelled to come to LA versus going back to the Bay Area. It's a more vibrant city. There's a lot more to do. And I think it's a differentiating factor for us, and it's been good. And on the personal front, it's I think a much better place to live than Silicon Valley.
What's the biggest lesson you have in terms of hiring the best talent across many different companies?
It's really not to compromise. I've seen many young entrepreneurs or early entrepreneurs, they need to fill a role. And instead of taking another month or a couple of months to find the right candidate, just hire the person in front of them because they need someone to do the job. And I think that compounds to a pretty mediocre place really quickly. And so I think not lowering the bar, no matter how long it takes to find the right talent, is a really key lesson for me.
So is hire fast, fire fast bullshit?
Yeah, that too. But more importantly, hire the right people. Like this, you don't have to fire them.
How have you changed most as a leader over time?
Well, I mean, look, I'm kind of an unusual animal in the sense that I started as an entrepreneur. I went into corporate stuff and I stayed in it for a decade. And some of my friends joked that they thought I would be in and out in a year. And you know, I stayed in PayPal for almost 4 years, and I stayed 7+ years at Facebook, which was an incredible run there. Just I had so many amazing lessons and amazing people like Mark to work with and others. And I feel like, I've learned to do both things. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I've learned to do things at large scale. And I find myself really back in my element in building something from scratch again as an entrepreneur again. And I think I've benefited from spending so much time in large scale organizations. I've learned so much. So I'm really excited to put all of this to work at Lightspark here with my team.
What was the biggest lesson from working with Mark at Facebook?
I mean, I think the lesson for the world is don't bet against him, because he is one of the smartest, instinctive people I've ever worked with. And he also is very competitive. And I think the one lesson as a leader, I think, is that he is the best listener that I've ever worked with. He's never touching a phone in a meeting. He will always listen intently to whatever people are saying. He will rarely interrupt people. And he's never afraid of asking questions, even if they may come across as things that he should know. And I think because of that, he's just one of the fastest, best learners out there. And so he can learn about a space better than I think anyone I know. So that's kind of an interesting lesson.
Final one for you. We do this show in 2028. Where are you and where's Lightspark then? Next 5 years?
So in 5 years, we're here in LA, so we haven't moved. And I think, Lightspark ideally is a successful entry point to this global and now thriving open protocol for money on the internet that the Lightning Network is going to be.
David, I want to apologize for jumping around quite so heavily as I did there. You've been fantastically patient with me. Thank you so much for joining me, and I can't wait to meet in person, having heard so much from Shaq.
Likewise. Thanks, Harry.
You are a star, my friend.